I received a question to answer this week, and this question is actually probably one of the most important questions that needs to be answered. And it is so important and so powerful a question that if you do not know the information to answer this question yourself, someone will answer it for you, and they will answer it in a way that most benefits them, and what most benefits them is your silence or your complicity. Whoa, this must be a pretty powerful question. Well, it may seem so, and in fact it is, but on the surface you might say, but it's very simple. So why don't we get right to the question and see what it is that is so powerful a question that needs to be answered this way. The question is very simply this: what is the role of the laity in the church? Doesn't seem too hard, does it? Very simple. What's the role of the laity of the church? Well, we all know the role. Well, do you? Let me give you the answer and then tell you some people who didn't. The answer to the question is the role of the laity of the church is to live the teachings of the church, live the gospel in such a way that they are acting in the way they live their life as prophets for the kingdom of God. So in a sense, they're called to preach the kingdom of God through their lives, and therefore they're called to be prophets for the kingdom of God. That's a lot more than many people may have understood. Oh, they may have understood, well, I'm supposed to do the right thing, and if I do the right thing, I get into heaven. No, you've been called to be prophets. St. Paul also adds another level where he says, we're all called to be ambassadors for the kingdom. So we are actually representatives of the kingdom of God. That's our call. So here we are called to be representatives of the kingdom of God. That's a lot more than many people have understood. They just thought, well, if we do the right thing and get up to heaven, God says you were good enough. No. Were you a prophet for the kingdom of God? And that's the question that needs to be asked right now. Am I being a prophet? And where am I not being a prophet that I need to change and to deepen my life? If we're living our faith as prophets, people's lives will change. And if we're living our faith as prophets, people will also learn to hate us. Why? Because they hated the prophets. So you got to understand that. When we see people not liking Catholics, that may be a sign that we're doing the right thing, or it may be a sign that we need to listen to why, and maybe we're being called to a metanoia. And that clearly has happened. Both cases have happened. So we need to look at that. What is our role as Catholics? To live our faith prophetically, and that's the role of the laity, actually above the others in the church. Oh, you thought it was the other way around. No, it isn't. The laity have that powerful role to preach the gospel in the world. Now let me give you an understanding there. That means you need to know your faith. You need to know your scriptures. This idea that if you're Catholic you don't have to read the Bible, throw that away. That's not true. Don't throw the Bible away, throw the idea away. You need to read the Bible. Particularly, you need to know the New Testament, and then you need to go back and know the Old Testament. Study the New Testament first. But you need to know the Bible. You need to be people of prayer. You need to build families of prayer. Because these are the ways prophets are created in our lives, in our own lives, and in the lives of our families, and the lives of our church. Oh, I don't have to go to church because I'm good enough to get to heaven. Are you a prophet? If you're saying you don't need to go to church because you're good enough to get to heaven, you're not a prophet. We need to be prophets, prophets for the Lord. That's what we've been called to be. That's what the laity have been called to. Now, I told you I'd give you a couple examples where that doesn't work. You see, if you don't know the answer to that question, someone else will answer it for you in the way that most benefits them, and what most benefits them is your silence or your complicity. So in the early part of this millennium, there was a group that tried to stage a coup of the Catholic Church. Now that sounds ridiculous, but it's true. It actually happened. And the movement was centered here in Boston. And what they wanted to do is they wanted to build a democratically elected church so that you would have democratically decided teachings which would make the teachings compliant to the way these people thought. The person who is described as the inspiration of the movement is not even, by the way, a Catholic or a Christian. But people bought into this. And how did they get into this movement? By believing this false teaching that the Catholic Church teaches that the Catholic laity are called to pay, pray, and obey. That's a lie. That's a blatant lie. But people heard that and said, oh yeah? Well, I'm going to do more than pay, pray, and obey, and I'm going to be part of this movement to change the church. And that's what happened. They got involved in this because they didn't know that wasn't part of the movement in the first place. Because the role of the laity is not to pay, pray, and obey. It's to be prophets for the Lord. That's what's there. Now, by the way, that doesn't mean you should be standing on street corners preaching, thumping a Bible, but there are some Catholics that have done that, the most powerful of which is a man by the name of Frank Sheed. If you're not familiar with who he is, look him up. There's another part of this that led people to have a false understanding, and it came from people's own beliefs inside the church. They looked at the role of the laity as to be like people on a bus. The priests and the religious and the bishops and the pope were driving the bus. They were riding along. And then, of course, when you get up to the gates of heaven, they get off the bus, walk right through the gates of heaven, because they were riding on the heaven bus. And people actually believe that. They'd say things like, well, it's the role of the priests and the religious to be holy for us. No, we're all called to holiness. Look at how many of the saints were not ordained. In fact, one that's often mentioned was ordained, but at the end of his life. So throughout his life, he was a layperson, radicalizing and changing the church in powerful ways. What was his name? St. Francis of Assisi. And of course, we know how close he is to our current Pope. So you can see the role of the laity is not to pay, pray, and obey. It's not to sit on a bus. It's to know your faith, to live your faith in such a way that you are being prophets. That means you need to study the Bible, you need to know your faith well, you need to know what the church teaches, and you need to live it. So the next time you turn around and say, I'm good enough to get to heaven, I don't have to go to church, you're not good enough to heaven because you're not being a prophet. Let's be prophets. God bless you.